Hey, what's up, guys? Little man with a big opinion here. So, my break is over, school year started, and so we're starting some videos up again. Today's video, I am reading an article from Fox News talking about how the US government wants to buy 10 times the amount of missiles, and this comes from us using a bunch of them in Iran, and um, they're finally, putting on paper the quiet part out loud, and that is that they want to have the capabilities to help deal with China. So, um, we can kind of read through this article. The opening talks about how in the last 5 months we've used most of our interceptor missiles. And they break down the numbers, saying in 2024 we purchased 230 THAAD interceptors. 2025 it was 214. And the most recent budget has us up to 360. Their objective is to go from a stockpile of 3,376 to 13,773. So, a pretty significant increase. The article goes on to talk about how, in the past, we had bought 328 in 2022, then it went down to 252 in 23, then 230, then 214, and now it's going back up into 320. They've requested an additional 317 million in mandatory reconciliation funding, so we can go from having 25 of the launch vehicles up to 37. Then for other stuff, they talk about just increasing numbers. Former military guys are talking about a lag in purchases. One rear admiral specifically talks about, let me find it. He's quoted as saying, the shortages were entirely foreseeable. And there have been arguments surrounding interceptor and munition procurement numbers for decades. So that's the meat and potatoes of the article. The last thing they mention is buying munitions on paper is only part of the battle. The rest is actually getting agreements for production. It's a good thing that on paper we've paid for them already, but now it's about actually getting the companies to make them and increase productions. I guess the last important thing is the report estimates the U.S. would require 7,082 PAC-3 interceptors and 1,394 THAAD interceptors for what it considers a minimum viable inventory in a conflict with China. I guess it's important to know that actual U.S. stockpile levels remain classified. The window of opportunity to bridge the interceptor gap is closing. I do like that they have comments on here. Um, you know, the top one says, every administration could have fixed this for the last 20 years. Trump 1, Trump 2, both years of Obama, plus one Biden, uh, and even Bush could have done something. This says, once again, the news is reporting on things that should not be said for the good of our country. That's it's one of those things that this isn't stuff that, adversaries probably don't already know. I like the idea, this is just a prepper staple. Burning through missiles faster than you can replace them is a feature of bad planning, not a bug. Instead of keeping our military properly equipped, we spend billions across the country on so many other issues. I can see an argument there. And, I just said that. It's one thing to say we're going to buy more stuff, it's another to actually produce more. I work in the defense industry, making PGMs, and we'd love to ramp up production, but we can't. The single biggest factor holding us back is the lack of skilled people. You have to be able to hold secret level security clearance to work here. And the moment a potential hire hears that we drug tested prior to hiring and then randomly during their employment, they get up and leave. How is it that America accounts for 1/3 of global military expenditure and is short on munitions? But it has been said a lot over the summer that a war with China is highly unlikely due to China's extreme dependence. They only have months of reserve oils, fertilizer, and food imports. Both would be instantly embargoed if a war started, not to mention their exports and income would virtually disappear overnight, leaving a couple 100 million people unemployed and really pissed off. I can kind of agree with that, although the part that most Americans are not ready for is the price of stuff to go up drastically. And just the lack of stuff, because we have also exported a lot of what we have. Partially because it's a lot cheaper, partially because, other places just do it better. There's a lot of reasons why we import a bunch of stuff. So, reading this from a prepping standpoint, I firmly believe in my lifetime we're going to deal with the conflict with China. And having the supplies necessary to weather that is something that most Americans probably aren't ready for. Dealing with the lack of stuff. Yes, they're going to do anything and everything to win. Every side's going to do that. But I also think we've gotten softer. If we lose internet for a day, we're bored. We feel like our minds are going crazy because we can't doom scroll or watch YouTube or play our video games. Or even simpler things like, I have a DVD player and a VHS player and a lot of the old Disney stuff. My son's 3. He can be entertained with that. Most people, if they can't stream their Disney Plus or YouTube, they don't have anything interesting. Even like the idea of board games or card games. And then that's just, that's like a convenience thing that would drive people crazy. It's not even required things like, there was an article talking about 7 states' water infrastructure got hacked. That's a requirement. How many people have 2 weeks worth of water stored up? How many people have 2 weeks worth of food stored up? How many have 2 weeks worth of food that they'd be perfectly willing to eat for the 2 straight weeks? Or, we've got two big old freezers that have, probably close to 6, 7-ish weeks of food in it. What happens if the power goes out? Do we have a backup plan? Do we have other food storages? I go back to the 3-year-old. He goes through phases of what he wants to eat and what he doesn't want to eat. So, we go through phases. How many of us have food that it's like, I don't really want to make that. I don't feel like eating that. Let's go to the store and get something else. Let's go out to eat. Go get something else. Is our stove gas? Is the gas still on? Is our electricity still on? How many meals can we cook on a barbecue pit before we run out of that propane? How many meals could we eat where we eat it? I've got crackers and tuna. How often could I eat that? That's the required stuff. But, what does some sort of conflict look like? The fun stuff. How many firearms and ammunition do you have? How often do you train with that? What medical training do you have? Do you even have a plan set? Like, what's your plan to get your group together? And, what is the line in the sand that gets your group together? How long until you're together? What's the logistics and the communication plan for people that live hours away and hundreds of miles? There's so many things that go into this that even when I was in the Army back in 2016, 2017, we were being asked these questions on what are we gonna do? They were training us and planning for this kind of issue, and that's a decade ago. And they'd probably, higher up people had probably been thinking about this, probably years before that. Probably since, China came onto the world stage. There's contingency plans for everything. But it's putting those things into place. The Army's preparing. We should be preparing too. The government plans and talks and discusses stuff. So we should be doing the same thing. If you got thoughts on this, let me know down below. Ask your questions. Leave your own comments. Subscribe to the channel. Like it. Share it with everyone you know. And I'll catch you on the next one.